Steve Reicher is the Bishop Wardlaw Professor of Social Psychology in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He is known for his work on crowd behaviour. He will be discussing the role of leadership in acts of collective violence. So please welcome Steve Reicher.
Well, hello, and thank you very much for inviting me. I speak to you from a sunny Scotland. It's always sunny in Scotland. Very sad I can't be with you in Toronto, a wonderful city. I do have actually a very close link to Toronto, I should admit to you, which is my bicycle comes from Toronto. It's a Cervelo Caledonia 5, which apparently is named after a street in Toronto. So every time I go out on my bicycle, I think of Toronto. And of course, being called Caledonia, it's another link between Scotland and yourselves. I'm going to be taking you back to the 6th of January and the assault on the Capitol, and asking a question which has already been asked in an impeachment trial, which is, what did Donald Trump have to do with it? To what extent was his leadership, was his speech significant in what happened? But before I can address that question, I need to go back a bit and look at Trump's toxic leadership more generally. And to understand Trump's toxic leadership, I need to talk about toxic leadership. And in order to talk about toxic leadership, I need to start by talking about leadership more generally. So I will, by the end, before I finish, get back to the 6th of January, but we have to go on a journey in order to get there. And I will try and take you on that journey. I am a social psychologist. For 40 years and more, I have been studying groups and group behavior and trying to challenge the dominant narrative, which is that the individual is rational and the group is a loss of rationality. And in particular, crowds, large groups, are an example of where people lose their selves, lose their minds, lose their morality, do virtually anything. The mob, the mad mob, the horde, all the languages we have to exemplify this. At the root of my work is the notion that if we are to understand group behavior, we have to address more fundamentally a construct in psychology, perhaps the most basic construct in psychology, which is that of the self, which we normally think of as something which defines the individual. What makes me unique compared to you? But work in psychology over the last few decades has stressed that actually the self is more complex than that. It's a system that exists at various levels of abstraction. So if I were to ask any of you, who are you? Certainly you would tell me something about yourselves as individuals. What makes you unique, your tastes, your likes, your dislikes. But you would also tell me something about your group memberships. You would tell me, I am Canadian, I'm a woman, I'm a sociologist, whatever it might be. You would tell me something about your social identities, which are every bit as important to you as your individual identity. Indeed, people will kill and people will die for social identities in a way that they never would do for their individual self. So it's not that the social identity is somehow secondary to the individual identity. It's a shadow. It's something that comes after. No, it's fundamental to our understanding of who we are. And the basis for my work on group behavior is the notion that it's not that we lose the self and therefore lose rationality, lose control, lose morality, lose our standards in the group. Rather, we shift from individual to social identity. We start to act in terms of we. We act in terms of the norms and the values of the group rather than our individual understandings, or when we look at others in terms of their group relationship to us, not their individual relationship to us. So it's not a loss of reason, It's a shift in the basis of reason. Indeed, that goes to the root of rational actor theory, because rational actor theory, the notion of human rationality, is normally a claim that we act in terms of self-interest. But once you problematize the self, once you say, but the self is a multiple thing, you have to start asking, what is the self of self-interest? And again, I would argue that the self of self-interest shifts in the group. And actually, it's very important that it shifts. If I was giving a talk, I've been giving lots of talks recently on the pandemic. One of the points I've been making is, if you think in terms of individual self-interest in a pandemic, if you're young and healthy and think, well, look, if I go out, I lose little because I'm unlikely to be affected by COVID. And if I stay in, I pay a big price because, being young, I don't want to be isolated at home. I have a 16-year-old in the other room, and I know how much he hates being isolated at home with his elderly parents. Then you would say to yourself, well, it is in my self-interest to go out, and you would break restrictions and you would spread the disease. But if you think in terms of collective self-interest, if you think in terms of the we, then if you go out, you'll spread the infection. You could infect, even kill some of the more vulnerable members of the community. And so the calculation shifts fundamentally. And although he's now disgraced, Andrew Cuomo early on made a very pertinent observation. He said, it's not an I thing, it's a we thing. Get your head around the we concept. Now, I want to use this we concept in order to address the question of leadership, the starting point on our journey this evening. In many ways, the developing theories of leadership over the last 50 years or so have been a trajectory along the lines of an argument which says that leadership is about much more than leaders alone. For many years, there has been what is called a great man theory of leadership. And it is a great man theory of leadership because the great are assumed to be men. Characters with special qualities, with the right stuff, which sets them apart from you or I and justifies their position over and above us. And with the dawn of the 20th century and the dawn of psychological measurement, psychologists sought to discover, what are those qualities? What are the characteristics? What are the personality traits, if you like, which define the right stuff? And if only we could measure them, if only we could distill them, if only we knew what the right stuff was, we could end up with the right leaders, when we so often seem to end up with the wrong leaders. And for 50 years or more, people tried, and there were hundreds of papers, literally hundreds, probably thousands of papers. And they were probably distinctive by their failure, because when you review the literature, you find that there is no characteristic which reliably explains for all leaders who succeeds and who fails, who's a good leader, who's a bad leader. The things you might expect: intelligence, plenty of leaders who don't score highly on intelligence who do very well, and plenty of leaders who score very highly on intelligence who do badly. Whatever characteristic you look at, you tend to find it doesn't explain very much. And after 50 years or more of failure, people came to a rather obvious realization. Leadership is not just about leaders. Leaders do very little on their own. There's a wonderful Brecht poem, which is an ode to the worker who thinks, and he asks, who built the pyramids? Was it the pharaohs? He asks, who won Napoleon's battles? The whole series of examples where he goes through and makes the obvious point that a leader is only as effective as their followers. And so a whole series of theories. We, at one point, curated 5 volumes of theories of leadership, and we only scratched the surface. Many of them looking at leader-follower relations. There are different models. There are transactional models, which see the relationship as an economic relationship. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. If a leader provides goods to their followers, followers will provide goods, in other words, followership to leaders. All very well, but the problem is that it misses out on what is important about leadership, which is the ability to transform people's understanding, their vision, their sense of needs. A general who couldn't persuade people that it is important to fight even if you might die would not be an effective general. And then transformational models which say, okay, well, it's all about vision. It's all about transforming people. It's all about having charisma. The problem is, how do you define charisma? And then you go back into individual characteristics and you lose the very point of having leader-follower theories. And again, when you think about it, it's fairly self-evident that leadership isn't just about leaders. Leadership isn't just about leaders and followers. Leadership is about leaders and followers always within a particular social group. A leader is always a leader of a particular social group, a leader of a country, a leader of a political party, a leader of a religion, and a leader who is viewed with passion by those within the group can be viewed with contempt and incomprehension by those outside the group. We look at Hitler now, for instance, and we see this pathological jack-in-the-box shouting and waving his arms and looking ridiculous. But of course, sadly, he was effective. We can look at examples closer to home. I grew up with Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister, adored. You only had to look at the pictures of people standing there waving their Union Jacks with looks of adoration on their faces. I could never make sense of it. I could never understand it because I didn't belong to that group. But leadership then is a relationship between leaders and followers within a social group. That's the premise of contemporary social identity models of leadership. And the argument is that what makes an effective leader is the ability not to tell us what to do, to impose on us, but to clarify for us who we are and what we value and how to achieve it. In other words, leadership is a process of social identity management. It's a way of proposing one's policies in ways that make them accord with our understanding of who and what we are. Many years ago in the 1990s, we studied a general election and we looked at Scottish political rhetoric. And what we discovered, the first point was that it wasn't just the Scottish National Party which appealed to Scottishness. They weren't unique in claiming that identity. Every party would protest its Scottishness and its love of Scotland. And in many ways, they had to because they were appealing to a Scottish electorate. If you wanted to mobilize this audience to support you, you had to speak to them in terms of an identity which brought them together, which brought the electorate together. The difference between them was much more in the ways in which they defined the content of Scottish national identity in a way that made their policies the instantiation, the realization, the concrete enactment of those values. And so in the typical election meeting, you would get somebody from the Conservative Party who would come in and say, they put their hand on their heart. I yield to nobody in my Scottishness, they would say. But what does it mean to be Scotland? I say to be Scottish is to be independent, to be entrepreneurial. Look at the great Scots like Andrew Carnegie, who went to the United States and built the railway system. That's what it means to be Scottish. And our policies of entrepreneurship and supporting entrepreneurs represent Scottish identity. So using identity, but constructing that consonance between identity and their own policies, claiming to be, if you like, the realization of our national identity. And then the Labour candidate would get up. They too would put their hand on their heart and tell you that they yield to nobody in their Scottishness, but protest to you that what Scottishness meant, it was about collectivity. It was about looking after each other in the neighbourhood. It was Rubby Burns and a man's a man for all that. And that Labour policies, welfarist policies, support for the welfare state, public spending, they represented national identity. So again, the same consonants, but different contents to the two. And then finally, perhaps the Scottish National Party would come in, claim their Scottishness with their hand on their heart and say, but what does it mean to be Scottish? It means to be independent. It means like Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, clashing swords with the English, and we represent the independent Scot. Okay, so leadership is very much a matter of defining identity, clarifying identity, claiming that one's own policies and one's own act and one's own self are representative of Scottishness. That the actor, the leader, the politician, him or herself, makes the claim to be one of us, to be typical, if not prototypical, of the nation, to represent what the nation represents, to be acting for the nation, not for themselves, and that their policies, as I say, are the concrete realization of that identity. So as I say, leadership, not as a process of the leader telling me what I should be doing, but rather that the leader is translating identity into action. Right? Not telling me what to do, but help clarifying for me what my identity, what my Scottishness or Canadianness or whatever it might be means in practice. But if leadership is about social identity management, what then makes leadership toxic? What are the characteristics of toxic leadership? And I want to look at it along two dimensions. First of all, what makes leadership toxic in terms of intra-group relations? In other words, what makes it autocratic rather than democratic? And what makes it toxic in terms of inter-group relations? In other words, when it generates oppressiveness and conflict. Now, in many ways, I think one of the key points about a social identity theory of leadership is that it overcomes what has always been a challenge to leadership, which is the tension between the agency of the leader and the agency of followers. And the question, can you have strong leadership which is democratic? Because a classic notion has been that a strong leader is a leader who obliterates the agency of their followers, because they are the great man who imposes themselves upon the people. And so the great leader, by definition, has an agency which is over and above that of the people. And equally, within leader-follower notions, you have the difficulty of the tension between the leader's agency and follower's agency. But within a social identity model, precisely because the relationship between leaders and followers is within the group, then you can have a position where you have a strong leadership in defining what the group is, but which still gives us space for followers to be involved as well. And so there are different modalities of leadership which depend upon the relationship between the leader and the follower in defining who we are. So what do I mean by that? Well, for me, genuinely democratic leadership is a leadership where the leader facilitates, creates a context in which there can be a conversation about who we are, a national conversation, if you like, at the national level. That the leader, in a sense, holds the ring in which we can debate what our identity is and what our identity means and how we should act in particular situations. More commonly in liberal democratic states, I think we have a more hierarchical notion of leadership. And that notion of leadership is that the leader has got precedence in defining who we are. The leader claims that their definition of identity is the only valid one, but they still allow other people to be involved in the conversation. They accept that others in the public sphere have a right to define nationhood. It's just they're wrong. Okay, so they will try and naturalize and reify and internalize their own definition. They will try and root it in history. They will try and root it in nature. We found that in our Scottish work, that people will say the Scots are communal. Why? Because of our harsh weather, we have to support each other to get through it. Attempts to not say this is a contingent social construction, it's a natural construction. But as I say, they might claim precedence, but they still allow space for others. Leadership becomes autocratic at the point where the leader becomes, if you like, fused with the category. The leader is the category, such that what the leader says defines who we are, and anybody who disagrees with the leader is out with the group, is defined as the no longer of the group, and therefore no longer having a right to participate in the conversation over who we are. And as soon as you see situations where leaders begin to say that anybody who disagrees with them is not of the nation, is not part of the debate, is excluded from, if you like, the public sphere, or at least the national sphere. If we're talking about national identities, then you know you're moving towards autocracy. When Trump started defining the judge who ruled against him as Mexican, when he defined Hillary Clinton as a criminal and therefore to be taken out of the public and incarcerated, when you saw Erdogan in Turkey begin to define, back when he first stood for president, his oppositions not as Turks but as Alevis or as Kurds, you knew you were moving towards autocracy. This question of who defines us is always a key political question. There's a key question of social forms. And actually, you see it historically most clearly, I think, in religion. The debate, for instance, over the translation of the Bible was utterly political, because if the Bible was the text through which we defined our identity, then the question of who was allowed to be able to read the Bible and therefore participate in those debates, it became a central issue of power, which is why people like William Tyndale, who first translated the Bible into English, were seen as extremely dangerous and were burnt at the stake, because they threatened the autocracy of the church precisely by allowing that text to be amenable to the public, who could then contest the interpretation of that text by the clergy. If you look at the history of the church, you find that in the UK in the 18th century, there were riots over prayer rails. And this was a slight rail about a foot high, 6 inches to a foot high, which separated the clergy from the congregation and symbolically gave the clergy the right to interpret the holy text, who we are, what we are as Christians, how we should behave as Christians, and excluded the congregation. A prayer rail 6 inches high impacted on that debate over who interprets the text, who defines who we are, in a way that became sufficiently important for people to riot over it. So at an intra-group level, in terms of the democracy of the group, what renders leadership toxic is not the fact that leadership is involved in interpreting the identity and therefore who we are and what we should do, but that the leader alone is allowed to say who we are, and anybody who goes against that is defined as outside the group and therefore doesn't have a right to speak. Now, let's turn from the intra-group to the inter-group. Let's turn from defining what toxicity in terms of relations within the group to defining toxicity in terms of relations to other groups.
We'll have 5 more minutes. Is that okay?
Oh, am I coming to an end in 5 minutes? My God, I'm only about halfway through.
Oh,
okay.
Okay.
Well, I will come to a preliminary conclusion. Then we can talk in discussion about the capital.
Okay.
Okay. In intergroup terms, I think what renders leadership toxic is bound up with what Carl Schmitt, the right-wing jurist of huge influence, man who had huge influence on people like Steve Bannon, determined as enemyship. The fact that we define ourselves not in relation to the other, but in many ways through a sense of existential threat from the other, a sense that we exist under a shadow of extermination by the other. Now, partly that justifies internal autocracy, because if somebody is trying to destroy you, we don't have the luxury of debate. But partly also it means that our existence and the interest of our group depends upon the destruction of the other, depends upon the obliteration of the other, since the other is trying to obliterate us. So what I'll do in my last few minutes, and then, as I say, we can talk about what happened on Capitol Hill in discussion, is to relate that to Donald Trump and the leadership of Donald Trump. And in some ways, I think of the leadership of Donald Trump in terms of what I call a twisted Jeremiad. There is, you will know more than I feel it's an act of hubris to talk to a North American audience about American politics. You probably know much more about it than I, but you will know that there is a key cultural form in American rhetoric which has been called the American Jeremiad, a great book by Berkovich a number of years ago. And it's based on the notion of a people of exception, the Pilgrim Fathers, the shining city on the hill, and that gives, if you like, a sense of exceptionalism and moral right and moral duty. But on the other hand, it always raises a question of whether the American people are living up to their moral purpose. Have they fallen short or not? And the American Jeremiad is an attempt to urge Americans to behave in particular ways by warning them about falling short of the original mission of the Pilgrim Fathers. And various people have pointed out some of the key speeches in American history are rooted in this logic. So, for instance, the Gettysburg Address, the 272 words, which probably are the most famous speech in history, start from that premise. 80 years ago and 10, we were born in liberty. So defining an original state of liberty from which we have fallen short, to which we must return. Or people have argued that Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, is a form of Jeremiad, claiming again this notion of equality from which Americans have fallen short and to which they must return. Now, I'm not arguing that these originals are truthful, that they are real. Many people will argue that, of course, no, the origins of the US were not about even the notion of a nation. That's what states' rights ideology does. Certainly not a nation founded in liberty, because slavery was built in to the origins of the Constitution. But nonetheless, rhetorically, this form of rhetoric which says we have this moral purpose, we are falling short of it, and enjoining people to act in order to return to that original moral purpose is critical. Now, Trump and the slogan, Make America Great Again, at some level accords with that Jeremiad logic. There is that notion of that origin, that exceptional origin of greatness, that notion of we've fallen short of it, and the enjoining that we have to act to return to our greatness, make America great again, implying that we were, implying that we're not now, implying that we need to do that temporal movement. And in that, I think one of the powers of Trump's speech is that it draws on that well-known form. The Gettysburg Address is Make America Great Again. I Have a Dream is Make America Great Again. Trump is Make America Great Again. In what sense is it twisted and toxic? Well, in two ways. And I think they fit very well with what I've been talking about toxic leadership. In one sense, it is that in the original, it is very much about enjoining individuals to change themselves, to make themselves great again. Okay, it's about you have fallen short of your moral purpose, and it is upon you to act. So there is a democracy to it. It is about the agency of the people. In Trump's version, it's very much about he will make America great again, that the people are incapable of doing it. He is their agency. He is the person who will achieve it for the people, because he in himself is the people, represents the people. So first of all, it has that autocracy to it, in that Trump is elided with America, elided with the category. He becomes the category. There's no space for anybody else apart from to go along with him, because if they don't go along with him, the people, they are out with the people. And the second point is that in the original Jeremiad, the failure is an internal failure. We have failed ourselves. We've done it to ourselves. We have to question ourselves. Whereas in Trump's version, of course, it's been done to us by enemies. The enemy without, whether that is migrants or foreign nations who've done us down, or the enemy within who colludes with that, the democratic swamp, those who don't care about the American people, the globalists in league with the enemies from without. So there is this construction of Trump as the agency of the people, and Trump as the people in a sense. And there is also this sense of this enemy who needs to be destroyed, who needs to be obliterated in order for America to be great again. And so it has that double toxicity of a leadership, an identity leadership, whereby Trump represents the identity, and the identity can only be preserved by the destruction of the other. And I will argue, if people want to discuss the speech itself, that that's what's so central to Trump's speech at the Capitol. People drew out one sentence. They drew out that sentence where he talked about fighting like hell. Now, that doesn't tell people what to do, but it's only understandable when you place it within the larger construction of the speech, which is doing precisely what he does in Make America Great Again. Precisely this notion that the people are being under attack by un-Americans, whether they be migrants who are falsely voting, or weak globalists who are colluding with them to take America away from the American people. And the implication in terms of action then is absolutely clear. They need to be obliterated for us to survive. And that's the roots of what we saw on the 6th of January on the Capitol in Washington. So I'm apologizing for going on slightly too long, and I'll stop there.
That's okay. Now we're going to take some questions. For those of you who have questions, you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen on reactions, and you can put raise your hand there, and we'll take your questions. So while we're waiting for that, Stephen, maybe you could, you wanted to add a little bit more, that we cut you off there. So while we're waiting for the questions, you might want to pursue that a little bit.
Okay. Well, let me then take you through a few elements of the speech. And Trump is nothing if not a very accomplished, not just rhetorical speaker, but also a performative leader. He performs in the choreography of his events, the social relations, the rhetoric that he's trying to persuade you of. So in his rallies, he performs the enemy without, the protesters in the room who are identified by him and expelled, often violently through his rhetoric. And he performs a victory over the enemy within in the way in which he points to the media and cows the media and talks about them as fake news and gets the audience to chant them down. His rallies are very much like little morality plays in which he is the agent who allows the people to silence the enemies who normally prevail over them. So the enemy without, who is normally taking your jobs, is expelled dramatically and performatively. And the media, who normally lie about you and have voice and silence the reality, they are silenced by your chanting. As I say, the rallies are like a dystopian vision of Trump's America, which sadly, to some extent, came to life. Now, let me just start by looking at how the speech starts. At the very start of the Capitol speech, he says, we have hundreds of thousands of people here, and I just want them to be recognized by the fake news media. And he calls to the media, says, turn your cameras, please, and show what's really happening here, because these people are not going to take it any longer. They're not going to take it any longer. Go ahead, turn your cameras, please. Would you show? Right. So right at the start, he's setting up this enemyship. He's setting up this sense that very practically you are up against a powerful establishment which is misrepresenting you. He begins to set up this dichotomy between the people and the establishment other, which is trying to obliterate them in various ways. And then he goes on to talk about this contrast by stressing very clearly how the crowd before him are the people. They are, if you like, the America he wants to make great again. So he says, it's just a great honor to have this kind of crowd and be before you, hundreds of thousands of American patriots who are committed to the honesty of our elections, the integrity of our glorious republic. All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing. So this contrast, my people, the patriots, the Americans, and on the other hand, those who are against us, defined in un-American terms, ultra-radical lefts who are linked to the enemy without. So right from the start of this speech, we see the setting up of this dichotomy, this sense of the people who Trump represents, having their America taken away from them by people who are un-American, either because they're outsiders or because they are people within the nation who betray the nation by who aren't patriots, who have non-national values and characteristics. So we see this construction right from the start of the speech.